6. Domestic and personal affairs. Frau Marx, who clung to her husband with heart and soul, was even harder hit than Marx himself by the terrible vexation at the infamous attack of Voigt. It cost her many sleepless nights, and although she held out bravely and made a fair copy of the whole, voluminous manuscript for the printer, she had hardly completed this work when she suffered a breakdown. A doctor was called in and he diagnosed the trouble as smallpox and ordered the children from the house immediately. Terrible days followed. The children were looked after by Liebknecht, whilst Marx and the loyal servant of the family, Lienken de Muth, attended to Frau Marx. She suffered agonies of burning pain, sleeplessness, anxiety for her husband, who never left her side, and the almost complete loss of her physical faculties, though she remained conscious all the time. A week later the saving crisis occurred, thanks to the fact that she had been vaccinated twice, and finally the doctor declared that the terrible sickness was in reality a piece of good fortune. The nervous exhaustion from which she had suffered for months had caused her system to fall victim to the poison somewhere or other, in a shop or a bus perhaps. But without this sickness her condition would undoubtedly have led to a dangerous nervous fever or something equally serious. Hardly had Frau Marx begun to recover when the accumulated anxiety, worries and torments which Marx had suffered caused him to fall sick also. For the first time his chronic liver trouble appeared in an acute form, and in his case also the doctor declared that the cause was the ceaseless and wearing excitement through which he had gone. Herr Voigt had not brought in a single penny, and the New York Tribune again placed him on half pay, so that creditors began to besiege the house. After his convalescence he decided, as his wife wrote to Frau Weidemeyer, to make a foray into Holland, the land of his fathers, tobacco and cheese, to see if he could persuade his uncle to part with some specie. This letter is dated the 11th of March, 1861, and its sunny good humor provides eloquent proof of the natural vitality which Jenny Marx possessed in her own way no less than did her husband. After long years of silence the Weidermeyers, who had suffered their share of this world's troubles during their American exile, wrote again, and Frau Marx immediately poured out her heart to the courageous and loyal companion in misfortune, the fighter and sufferer, declaring that the one thing which gave her sufficient courage to keep going in all the misery and wretchedness, the one bright spot in our existence, the light of our lives, was the joy in their children. 17-year-old Jenny took after her father with her rich, dark and glossy hair, her equally dark, brilliant and soft eyes, and her dark Creole complexion which shows a typically English blossom. The 15-year-old Laura was more like her mother, with her wavy, curly, chestnut hair and her green iridescent eyes flashing like fire. Both girls have a really beautiful complexion, and at the same time they are really so little vain that in secret I am often surprised. All the more so because I cannot say the same for their mother when she was that age and still in short skirts and frills. However, although the two eldest daughters were a great joy to their parents, the idolized darling of the whole house was the youngest daughter, Eleanor, or Tussie, to give her pet name. The child was born when our poor little Edgar died, and all the love and tenderness we bore him was then transferred to his little sister. And the older girls looked after her and nursed her with almost motherly care. But then it would really be difficult to find a more lovable child, as pretty as a picture and sweet-tempered. In particular, she prattles delightfully. She has learned that from the brothers Grimm, who are her constant companions day and night. We all have to read the fairy tales aloud to her until we are almost exhausted, but woe betide us if we leave out so much as a word of the story of Bluebeard or Little Snow White or Rumpelstiltskin. Thanks to these fairy tales the child has learned German, and she speaks it with remarkable accuracy and grammatical precision, and, naturally, she has learned English as a matter of course. The child is Karl's favorite, and her laughter and her merry chatter dispel many of his worries. Then she praises the faithful friend and servant of the house. Lienken, ask your husband about her, he will tell you what a treasure we have in her. She has been with us now for 16 years and braved all the storm and stress of our lives. The charming letter ends with a report on Karl's friends, and those who had proved themselves wanting in loyalty to him she condemns in her feminine fashion even more sternly than he would have done. I dislike half measures, she writes, explaining why she broke off all relations with the distaff side of the Freiligrott family. In the meantime, the foray into Holland had been fairly successful, and after visiting his uncle Philips, Marx went on to Berlin to see if anything could be done to found a party organ. A proposal which Lassalle had made repeatedly. The lack of such an organ had made itself felt keenly, particularly during the crisis, and, thanks to the amnesty which William, now King William, had proclaimed in January, 1861, after coming to the throne, there was now a possibility of making good this deficiency. The amnesty was miserable enough in all conscience and full of traps and reservations, but at least it permitted the one-time editors of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung to return to Germany. Marx was received with the greatest friendliness by Lassalle in Berlin, but the place remained personally unsympathetic to him. No politics of any caliber, but merely squabbles with the police, and the antagonism between the military and the civilians. The atmosphere in Berlin is insolent and frivolous. The chambers are treated with contempt. Even compared with the conciliators of 1848, who were certainly no Titans. He found the Prussian Chamber of Deputies with its Simpsons and its Vinks a queer mixture of bureaucracy and the school bench. The only halfway decent figures, at least in appearance, in this gathering of pygmies were Waldeck on the one hand and Wagner and Don Quixote von Blankenberg on the other. However, he thought he could detect a general tendency towards enlightenment and, amongst a great section of the public, dissatisfaction with the bourgeois press. People of all classes regarded a catastrophe as inevitable. In the elections which were to take place in the autumn, the former conciliators, who were regarded as Red Republicans by the king, were certain to be elected. Matters might then come to a head over the new military budget. Marx therefore regarded Lassalle's plan for founding a paper to be worth considering, at least in principle. However, he was not in agreement with Lassalle in matters of detail. The latter proposed that the editorship of the paper should be in the hands of a triumvirate consisting of Marx, Engels and himself, but with the proviso that Marx and Engels should have only one vote between them on matters of policy, as otherwise he would find himself outvoted every time. This extraordinary suggestion would have meant trouble from the beginning, and it is probable that Lassalle let it fall only in a chance conversation, but in any case, this is not important in view of the fact that Marx was not inclined to give him any important say in connection with the paper at all. Writing to Engels, he declared that, dazzled by the reputation he had won in certain learned circles by his Heraclitus, and in certain parasitic circles by his good table and wine, Lassalle was naturally unaware of the fact that he was discredited amongst the general public. And then there is his dogmatic insistence that he is always right, his hopeless attachment to the speculative conception, his infection with old French liberalism, his boastful pen, his self-assertiveness and tactlessness, etc. Under strict discipline he could render good service as one of the editors, but otherwise he would only do us harm. This was Marx's report to Engels on his negotiations with Lassalle. And he added that in order not to wound his host he had postponed the final decision until he had discussed the matter with Engels and Wilhelm Wolff. Engels harbored the same misgivings as Marx and also opposed Lassalle's proposals. In any case, the whole plan turned out to be what Lassalle had once prophetically termed it, a castle in Spain. Part of the cunning of the Prussian amnesty was that, even when it permitted the fugitives of the revolutionary years to return to their homes under halfway tolerable conditions, it did not give them back their civil rights and their nationality which, according to Prussian law, they had lost by a stay of longer than 10 years abroad. The men who returned under such conditions were likely to be chased across the frontier at any moment at the whim of a bad-tempered police jack in office. Marx's own situation was even worse because several years before the revolution he had voluntarily abandoned his Prussian nationality. It is true that he was goaded into doing so by police chicanery, but this did not alter the fact that he had voluntarily abandoned his nationality. Lassalle represented him in the matter and moved heaven and earth to secure return of his Prussian citizenship. He waited zealously on the police president of Berlin, von Zedlitz, and on the Minister of the Interior, Count Schwerin, one of the most prominent supporters of the new era, but all to no purpose. Zedlitz declared that the only objection to the renaturalization of Marx was his Republican or at least non-royalist convictions. Whilst replying to Lassalle's urgent exhortations not to indulge in the same inquisition of conscience and persecution on account of political convictions he had so sharply condemned in his predecessors Manteuffel and Westphalen, Schwerin declared tersely, "For the moment at least there appears to be no particular reason for granting renaturalization to the person in question. A state like Prussia could not digest a man like Marx, and in this respect, the obscure ministers, Schwerin and his predecessors, Manteuffel and Kuhlwetter, were right." After leaving Berlin, Marx made a detour to visit old friends in Cologne and in particular to see his old mother again, who was rapidly approaching her end. In the beginning of May he was again in London, where he now hoped to be able to escape the exhausting life he had been leading and to find time and peace enough to finish his book. While in Berlin he had succeeded in making arrangements with Die Press in Vienna despite his repeated earlier failures. And the paper promised to pay him £1 for each article and 10 shillings for each report. At the same time his connection with the New York Tribune showed signs of improvement again, and it repeatedly printed his articles with express praise of their excellence. These Yankees have a peculiar habit of handing out testimonials to their own correspondents, he wrote. Die Press in Vienna also made a lot of his contributions, but still, his old debts had never been completely paid off, and the fact that he had earned nothing during his sickness, coupled with the expenses of the journey to Germany, combined to flush all the old filth to the surface again, as he put it. In his New Year's greetings to Engels he added that unless it turned out to be better than the old one it could go to the devil as far as he was concerned. Not only was the year 1862 no better for Marx, but it was even worse. Although Die Press advertised his contributions widely, it treated him if anything in an even more scurvy fashion than did the American paper. In March he wrote to Engels, "I am not so much concerned about the fact that they don't print the best articles. But it is financially impossible for me when they print only 1 out of 4 or 5 and pay only for 1. That depresses me far below the standard of the penny-a-liners." During the course of the year all connections with the New York Tribune were broken off. The reason is not quite clear, but it seems to have been chiefly due to the American Civil War. Although, therefore, this war brought him considerable personal misfortune, Marx welcomed it with the greatest sympathy. "Let there be no mistake about it," he wrote a few years later in the preface to his scientific masterpiece. Just as the American War of Independence sounded the tocsin for the European middle class in the 18th century, so the American Civil War sounded it for the European working class in the 19th century. His letters to Engels show that he followed the course of the war with close interest. He regarded himself as a layman in military matters and gladly listened to what Engels had to say on the matter, and the latter's observations are still of the greatest value today. Not only from the military standpoint, but also politically. For instance, he went to the very core of the military and militia question with the words, "Only a society based on and educated in communism can approach closely to the militia system, and even then it will not completely achieve it." The words of Goethe, "In der Beschränkung zeigt sich erst der Meister," are applicable here, though in a different sense from that intended by the poet. The mastery which Engels had achieved in military matters limited his general horizon, and the miserable military leadership of the northern armies sometimes made him doubt their final victory. Writing in May, 1862, he declared, "What makes me doubt the victory of the Yankees is not so much the military situation in itself, for that is merely the result of the general slackness and apathy which is typical of the North. But where is their evolutionary energy amongst the people? They let themselves be drubbed and are really proud of the kicks they are getting. Where can one find throughout the North a single indication that they mean serious business in any respect? I have never seen such a thing, not even in Germany in its worst days. The Yankees seem to extract most pleasure from the prospect of swindling their creditors." In July he was afraid that all hope was lost for the North, and in September he declared that the Southerners, who at least knew what they wanted, seemed like heroes to him in comparison with the slackness of the Northerners. Marx, however, staunchly believed in the final victory of the Northern states, and in September he answered, "As far as the Yankees are concerned, I am still quite convinced that they will win in the end. The way in which they are waging the war is quite natural for a bourgeois republic which has been ruled so long by fraud. The southern states are ruled by an oligarchy, and an oligarchy is better suited for waging war, particularly an oligarchy like the one in the southern states where all productive labor is performed by the niggers and the 4 million whites are freebooters by profession. But for all that I am prepared to stake my head that these fellows will get the worst of it in the end." He was right. And his judgment that in the last resort war too would be decided by the economic conditions under which the belligerents lived was vindicated. This wonderful clarity was all the more remarkable because the same letter revealed the pressing straits in which Marx found himself at the time. They were so desperate in fact that he had decided to do something he could never bring himself to do previously and never did again. He informed Engels that he was doing his best to get some sort of job and that he had every prospect of obtaining employment in the offices of one of the English railway companies. In the end he failed. He was unable to decide at the time whether this was piece of misfortune or luck, because his handwriting was not good enough. The poverty of his family grew more and more bitter, and the situation was made worse by the fact that he repeatedly fell ill. Apart from his old liver trouble, he began to suffer from painful boils and carbuncles, and this new trouble stayed with him on and off for years. The general hopelessness of the situation also threatened to cause another breakdown in his wife's health. The children had not even proper clothes and footwear to go to school in, and whilst their school friends were amusing themselves in the year of the Great Exhibition, they had a horror of visits on account of their poverty. The oldest daughter, who was by this time old enough to realize the truth of the situation, suffered terribly under it, and without her parents' knowledge she made an attempt to train herself for the stage. Things grew so bad that Marx finally made up his mind to a step which he had often considered but always abandoned out of consideration for his daughter's education. He decided to leave his furniture to the landlord, who had already put in the bailiffs, to inform all his other creditors that he was bankrupt, to obtain positions for the two elder girls as governesses through the good offices of English friends of the family, to find Lincoln Demuth some other employment, and to move with his wife and youngest daughter into one of those blocks of buildings which had been run up to meet the needs of the poorer classes. In the end, however, and thanks to Engels, this counsel of despair was not followed. Engels' father had died in the spring of 1860, and Engels had then been given a better position in the firm of Ehrman and Engels, with the prospect of later becoming a partner, though this improvement meant also that he would have to live in greater style than before. In addition, the American crisis weighed heavily on the business and cut down his income considerably. In the early part of 1863 he also suffered a great personal misfortune. Mary Burns, the Irish girl with whom he had lived for 10 years without the sanction of society, died, and her death was a terrible blow to him. Writing to Marx he declared, "I simply cannot describe my feelings. The poor girl loved me with her whole heart." But Marx answered with less sympathy than Engels had expected, and this fact alone showed more strikingly than anything else could have done how deeply he was in trouble himself. He referred to Engels' great loss with a few rather cool words, and then went on to describe the desperate situation in which he found himself, declaring that unless he could get hold of a fair amount of money at once he would not be able to keep his head above water for more than a couple of weeks. It is true that he found it disgustingly egotistical to plague his friend with other people's troubles at such a moment, but, after all, what can I do? In the whole of London there is no one to whom I could even speak openly, and at home I have to play the silent stoic in order to forestall an outburst from the other side. However, Engels had been hurt by the frosty reception his misfortune had met with at Marx's hands, and in his reply, which he delayed for a few days, he made no attempt to conceal his feelings, but at the same time he made a number of proposals to assist Marx out of his trouble, though he declared that for the moment he was not in a position to raise any large sum of money. Marx too delayed his reply for a few days, but only in order to give Engels a chance to calm down, and not in order to persist in the wrong he had done by his lack of sympathy. He denied the suggestion of heartlessness, but he frankly admitted that he had not expressed a proper sympathy. In this letter and in a later letter he described the situation which had put his head in a whirl. The tone he uses is tactful and conciliatory, because it is probable that Engels was wounded chiefly by the fact that Frau Marx had not sent him a word of sympathy on the death of his beloved friend. "Women are funny creatures," wrote Marx, "even the most intelligent. In the morning my wife cried over the death of Mary and your loss so much that she quite forgot our own misfortunes, which culminated on that very day. But in the evening she felt that no one in the world knew what suffering was unless he had the bailiffs in the house and children to feed." The first words of regret had mollified Engels immediately, and he wrote, "One cannot live for years with a woman and then not feel her death terribly. I felt that my youth had been lowered into the grave with her. When I received your letter she was still unburied. Frankly, your letter was in my head for a week and I couldn't forget it. Never mind, your last letter has made up for it, and I am heartily glad that I did not lose my oldest and best friend together with Mary." This was the first and last sign of tension that ever showed itself between the two men. Thanks to an extremely daring coup, Engels succeeded in raising £100, and with this sum Marx was able to keep his head above water without moving into cheaper lodgings. He managed to scrape his way through the year 1863, and towards the end of it his mother died. It is unlikely that he inherited very much from her, and it was in fact the £800 or £900 which he received later as the chief legatee of Wilhelm Wolff which afforded him a generous breathing space. Wilhelm Wolff died in 1864, deeply mourned by both Marx and Engels. He was only 55 when he died, but in the storm and stress of an adventurous life he had never spared himself. And Engels even complained that his obstinate devotion to his duties as a teacher had hastened his end. Thanks to his great popularity amongst the Germans in Manchester, he had worked his way up into quite comfortable circumstances, but the first years of his exile had been difficult enough. It would seem too that shortly before his death his father had left him a small inheritance. Later Marx dedicated the first volume of his immortal work to his unforgettable friend, a brave, loyal and noble pioneer of the proletariat. And Wilhelm Wolff's last gesture of friendship did much to give Marx the peace he needed in order to work on it. The worries and troubles of his life had not been banished forever, but they never returned in quite the same heartbreaking fashion of the previous years, because in September, 1864, Engels signed a contract with Hermanns which made him a partner in the firm, and from then on he was in a position to continue his unfailing assistance with a still more generous hand.